A millionaire called Veronica Hale walked into a ballroom with a plan so cold that the chandeliers seemed to reflect her intent. She had a ring box in her hand and a guest list full of names that had once laughed at her decisions. Why would she marry a man who lived in a room above a laundromat on a Tuesday afternoon just to humiliate him in front of everyone who had ever doubted her? Before you go, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Veronica Hale was flawless in a gown that swallowed the light, unshaken and precise. Elijah Brooks smelled like laundry soap and city rain, hands that had learned to work with their palms rather than wait for opportunity. Seconds after the vows, the room would hush, and the plan that flashed in Veronica's eyes would begin to unravel faster than anyone could say scandal. Everything started with a dare and a camera, and what followed would pull at reputation, money, and a secret that someone had buried for too long. The first time Veronica saw Elijah, he was standing beneath a flickering neon sign that said "Open 24 hours," coat clutched to his ribs against a November wind. The smell of fried dough and diesel hung in the air, the sidewalks stuck with gum, and the distant echo of subway brakes was like a heartbeat. Veronica did not stop because of pity. She stopped because she wanted to prove a point. She stepped out of a black car that whispered success with every shutter, and the click of her heels matched the city's pulse. "Do you want to come to a party tonight?" she asked, voice smooth like a glass of expensive wine. He blinked. The word party landed awkwardly against his tired bones. "I do not go to parties," he said, hands tucked in his coat as if trying to warm them from promises. "This is not that kind of party," she replied, and there was the first crack of mischief. The street smelled like rain and oil, and the faint perfume she left in the air smelled like roses and power. He asked why. She smiled like a verdict and said, "Because it will make them uneasy." The exchange that followed was short and sharp. "You do not know me," he said. "I know enough," she answered. "Come with me for one night, be my date, and then return to your life." The idea was a small cruelty wrapped in silk, a test of theater. The transformation was methodical and theatrical. They moved from neon hum to a suite with mirrors that ate the light, mirrors that showed not only faces but possibilities. Inside the room, the air smelled of hairspray, citrus cleanser, polished wood, and new leather. Veronica watched as professionals set to work like engineers of identity. "Sit down," said Isabel, the couturier, fingers already sketching the angles of his shoulders. Elijah breathed in the scent of salon heat and coffee, and out came a laugh that tasted of disbelief. The makeup artist, Noah, hummed while he worked, the bristles whispering across skin. "This will be subtle," he said, blending foundation in strokes that matched the rhythm of the room. The tailor Maria measured and taped fabric to his body, the tape making a soft, papery sound. "We will not erase who you are," Maria said. "We will frame you differently." Perfume was applied, a single spritz smelling of bergamot and something warm, as if the room tried to promise another life. The soundscape included the rustle of tissue paper, the click of scissors, a faint distant traffic, and the quiet murmurs of handlers checking cameras. Elijah felt silk slide over his nervousness, felt the weight of polished shoes that ticked like a clock on marble. He practiced a smile in the mirror, and it looked fragile, like glass warmed by breath. But with each stroke of the makeup and each tuck of cloth, the face looking back began to claim more space. "Are you sure about this?" he asked the stylist. "I will be okay," he lied. "Do not pretend to be someone you are not," whispered Naomi, an old friend who had come at Veronica's invitation to help guide him. "We will not pretend," Elijah answered, and that night his look became an argument in silk. They arrived at the event with cameras fluttering like birds. The red carpet smelled of perfumes, hot wax from flashes, the faint saltiness of nerves. Guests murmured, champagne glasses tingled, and the band played a smooth intro that tried to turn breath into rhythm. Veronica walked deliberately, heels marking time. Elijah followed a step behind, the contrast so sharp that someone murmured into a microphone, "Who is that with Veronica?" The compound word of gossip spread into the room like a wind. Reception staff moved silently. Plates landed with a soft clack. The chandeliers poured a low, honey light over faces. "You look good," Veronica said with a precise smile as they stepped into the spotlight. "Are you ready?" Elijah whispered, the salt on his lips tasting like the subway station he remembered from childhood. "I am always ready," Veronica replied, her tone both threat and promise. The photographer, Henry, directed them into place, camera clicking like a small percussion section. The air tasted of buttered canapés and expensive cologne. A woman in sequins tapped her phone and whispered into it, the sound sharp. "Do not make a scene," said Olivia, Veronica's PR manager, fingers tapping an agenda that smelled faintly of lemon and ink. "A little pain for the cameras," Veronica murmured. The first moments at the event were the edges of the trap. In the months before this night, Elijah's life had been a slow compression of small humiliations and stubborn pride. He had grown up in a neighborhood of brick stoops and corner stores, where money was an occasional visitor and work was a steady presence. His mother, Denise, worked double shifts as a nurse, her hands rough from linens and life. Elijah had taken odd jobs from the age of 12, shining shoes, delivering groceries, carrying crates. He learned to read ledges at night under the weak lamp of a rented room. And he learned empathy from the people who crossed his path and trusted him to fix things a landlord refused to. He had once been an apprentice at a small legal clinic until budget cuts closed its doors. The clinic had taught him patience and paperwork, the smell of toner and the sound of old photocopiers humming like small whales. After the clinic closed, he had become a handyman for a building that housed artists, musicians, and 20 different languages. He knew the city by the way rain pooled at certain corners, by the pattern of pigeons on a bakery sill, by the best dumplings at 3 in the morning. His hands were precise, not elegant, hands that could fix a leaking pipe and mend a torn sleeve. When the laundry room above which he slept caught fire, he rescued what he could, carrying away a box of old papers with a trembling reverence. Those papers contained a name that would change everything. He believed in quiet honesty and in the awkward dignity of holding a job until dawn. His backstory was not a roadmap to revenge, but a catalog of small virtues stacked like bricks. He knew what it was to be overlooked, to be spoken to with thin sympathy, to be used as a lesson in a conversation. These memories lived in his pockets like loose coins, jingling with the rhythm of a life that hardly anyone considered heroic. Veronica Hale's past was a different geography. Born into a family that had pockets wide enough to float boats, she had been taught to trade kindness for control. Her father, Thomas Hale, built a construction empire on a foundation of charm and intimidation, and Veronica learned early the music of leverage. She sat at long mahogany tables, ate food that tasted of fine oil, and polished her smile until it shone. Her first marriage had been a contract disguised as love, dissolved when headlines fit better with her ambitions. Veronica had a way of reading rooms and turning small gestures into monuments. She navigated hosts and investors with a knife edged with smiles. The stability in her life was currency, measured in deals and columns, in board seats and foundations that bore the family name. To her, everyone was either a ladder or a footstool. The moment she decided to make Elijah a spectacle was not a thoughtless cruelty, but a carefully measured arrow. She intended to make a statement about charity and power, and the thrill of humiliating someone who had once refused to look at her as an equal. Yet she carried secrets too, a ledger of decisions made with guarded hands, papers tucked into drawers that smelled of cedar and old sand. Money. The arrogance that had propelled her also hid vulnerabilities, a fear that any misstep might pull loose everything she had spent decades assembling. She had enemies, soft and sharp, people who smiled while plotting revenge, colleagues who envied her success, and bankers who listened for the crack in her composure. Her backstory was a polished, dangerous thing. As the night advanced, the plan unfolded. Veronica took the microphone and her voice cut through the music like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice exact, "tonight we celebrate generosity." The crowd leaned. "And generosity sometimes requires sacrifice." A ripple of polite laughter. "I have found a partner for this demonstration," she announced, and the room leaned closer like birds around a light. "Meet Elijah Brooks." A hush like a hand dropping over a glass. Cameras swarmed. Elijah felt every eye on him as if they were hands peering into his ribs. "What are you doing?" Naomi hissed into his ear. "Trust me," he said. Olivia, the PR manager, smiled a smile that meant everything had been predicted. "We will play this carefully," she whispered to Veronica. The exchange that followed between Veronica and Elijah was a tight choreography of razor wit. "Do you take this man to be your partner in this experiment?" Veronica asked, voice flavored with irony. "I do," said Elijah, and his voice sounded small in the hall. The officiant, appointed as a theatrical piece, chanted words that sounded like vows and verdict. In one breath, the room collectively inhaled. Cameras clicked. Champagne bubbled like a small frenzy. Then Veronica slid a ring onto Elijah's finger and laughed, a laugh that tasted like triumph. Seconds later, the laughter was a small thing compared to the silence that followed when Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out a stack of papers, the edges slightly yellowed, a sheaf that smelled faintly of damp cardboard and the dust of basements. The papers were a quiet storm. They bore the mark of an auditor and a list of dates, invoices, contractor names, and a pattern of payments concealed in shell companies tied to Veronica's foundation. The room smelled suddenly of old paper, ozone from the flashes, and an undercurrent of fear. "What is that?" someone asked. "Is that evidence?" Henry, the photographer, muttered into his camera, breath fogging with disbelief. Elijah's voice, when he spoke, was steady in a way that surprised everyone. "I found these in a box that was near the lockers the night the laundry burned," he said, eyes sweeping the room. "They show a trail of payments to a company that never did any work, and names of people who signed off on projects that never existed." Veronica's face changed incrementally from amusement to that rare exposure that comes when light passes through a window and leaves everything transparent. "This is not a joke," she said, throat dry. Olivia moved closer, as if to take the papers and make them disappear into her handbag, but Naomi stepped between them with a hand that shook. "You cannot do this," Veronica breathed. "You invited me here," Elijah said. "You chose humiliation as entertainment. I chose truth as a reply." The microphones were alive with the moment, and somewhere at the back a journalist named Samuel scribbled, his pen scratching like a small animal. The first wave of murmurs swelled into talk and then into the metallic sound of a phone calling a newsroom. This was the point where the story climbed into the public arteries. Within hours, articles appeared online, sharper than anyone expected. Headlines used words like scandal, embezzlement, charity fraud, and Veronica's name sang through social feeds like a siren. Investors called, boards requested explanations. Olivia, who managed image with the precision of a clockmaker, assembled statements that smelled of corporate lemon and practiced empathy. "We have opened an internal review," she announced, voice all control. Veronica held a glass that trembled like a small planet. At a table in a quiet office, an investigator named Rosa Vega received the tip, and her hair smelled faintly of coffee and determination. "Send me everything," she told her assistant, and the sound of the line closing was a seal. The legal process began like the steady turning of gears. Subpoenas were drafted by the law firm of Price and Sutherland, their letters crisp and authoritative. An accountant named Charles Mendelson began to trace the payments, eyes narrowing at the pattern that unfolded in spreadsheets like a map. The technical description that followed was precise and dry. Investigators cross-referenced bank transfers with contractor invoices, subpoenaed emails and financial statements, and traced shell corporations through a chain of nominee directors and offshore accounts. The process required 45 days of document collection and forensic analysis to map the diversion of funds. The procedural language smelled of toner and late nights, and it would be entered into a court file with the kind of sterile attention that turns rumor into peril. As the scandal grew, Veronica tried to fight. She employed crisis teams and PR strategies, issued statements that promised cooperation and reformed oversight. Her voice on television was steady, but there was a tremor under her skin that even makeup could not conceal. "We will make this right," she said in an interview, and viewers watched for the crack that would betray truth. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in small rooms with journalists, his hands folded, the smell of coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights keeping him company. He explained how he had found the papers and how he had not gone to the police at first because he feared nothing would happen and because he loved anonymity more than headlines. Naomi stood by him like a worn shoulder to lean on. She had been a caseworker once, then an organizer, and she understood how systems swallowed good intentions. "I only wanted people to know," Elijah said to Rosa during a brief meeting. "I wanted my neighbors to know." That money that was meant to repair roofs and fix heaters was used to smooth boardroom egos. The tension between private truth and public spectacle became a media currency. Articles used words like betrayal, greed, mismanagement, and readers commented with a mixture of outrage and relish. The next escalation was legal and theatrical. A civil suit turned into criminal charges as investigators uncovered a broader network. Veronica's auditors found inconsistencies, signatures forged, and approvals that had been funneled through companies that existed only on paper. The moment of suspense arrived during a televised hearing where Veronica appeared with a bank statement in her hand and lawyers who wore patience like armor. "These are honest mistakes," her lead counsel argued, voice arranged to sound reasonable. Cross-examination turned the case into a public performance. The prosecution called witnesses who described invoices that had never been fulfilled, contractors who had never received payments, and a philanthropist who had been promised community projects that never materialized. The courtroom smelled of old varnish, cheap coffee, and the squeak of leather. Tensions tightened. Each testimony added weight to the pile of allegations, and each member of Veronica's social circle measured the direction of the wind. Naomi, who had been a friend of Veronica years ago before they had drifted, gave a statement that felt like a small earthquake. "I saw funds moved and promises broken," Naomi said. "The city deserved better." Veronica's reaction was a mixture of anger, confusion, and fear. She had not expected her world to collapse in such a visible way. The climax arrived in a way that no one expected at first. Veronica, who had once used ceremonies to demonstrate power, now found herself parsed under the microscope of accountability. On the day the judge read the preliminary findings, a line of cameras collected outside the courthouse like a metal wave. Elijah watched from the gallery as hearings unfolded, his chest a steady machine of nerves and resolve. The prosecution presented a timeline of transactions and statements that painted a clear picture of deliberate diversion. These funds were intended for repairs, community programming, and employment support, the prosecutor said. Veronica's defense tried to suggest clerical errors, negligence, poor bookkeeping. The judge listened like a person threading a needle. When the ruling was spelled out, it felt like an audible unbuttoning of a garment. Exposure and consequence folded together. Veronica was held responsible for multiple counts of fraud and misappropriation, her reputation collapsing in a sequence that played everywhere from morning news to late-night commentary. The room smelled of polished wood and the small metallic tang of justice in motion. There was no dramatic arrest in front of the courthouse. Instead, there were summonses, freezing orders on accounts, and the quiet dismantling of a foundation. People who had once celebrated Veronica now checked how their names had been linked in emails and listservs. The public humiliation was precise, and it matched the cruelty that had started the whole affair. Aftermath, personal and professional lives shifted. Veronica sat in rooms once full of allies, now filled with lawyers. Investors withdrew, meetings evaporated, and the properties she had held as symbols of success were reassessed for their true value. Elijah, on the other hand, found himself unexpectedly propelled into a role he had no training for. Offers came from journalists, from community organizers, from a small group of investors who wanted to turn funds back into the neighborhoods that had been abandoned. "We should use this to build something real," said Charles, the accountant, in a meeting that smelled of stale coffee and new browning paper. Samuel, the investigative journalist, pushed a stack of notes across the table. "Your voice matters here," he said. "You can choose to stay small or to help build systems that prevent other people from being preyed upon." Naomi advised caution, noting the fatigue and attention could be corrosive. "The spotlight heals as it burns," she said. There was a slow conversation about what justice meant beyond punishment: restitution, community rebuilding, transparency. Elijah thought of his mother, the nurses on night shifts, and the people who never had their names in headlines. He thought of roofs and heating systems and a small legal clinic that once taught him the power of paperwork. Slowly, he began to accept offers to consult on community projects, to help design oversight committees that made sure funds were audited and projects verified. The twist that Veronica had not foreseen was that humiliating him handed him leverage he had never asked for. Emotion intertwined with consequence in complicated ways. Veronica, bruised and reflective, had moments when she visited the edges of regret. She walked through properties and felt for the first time the weight of the promises she had broken. "I thought it was performance," she said to Olivia in a quiet hour. "I thought image could repair what I had not done." Veronica's apology came in stages: public statements that smelled of cedar and contrition, and private conversations where she faced the people affected. Some accepted apologies. Others wanted hard accounting and not mere words. Community groups demanded restitution and verification. The legal system pursued charges, fines, and structural reforms to the foundation's governance. The technical work of restructuring included appointing a receiver to oversee assets and instituting compliance officers to monitor grants and expenditures. Those legal steps required careful language, clear deadlines, and binding oversight, words and documents that smelled of bureaucracy and intention. 1 month later, Elijah had signed the first grant agreement in a small room with paper that smelled like the future. The grant was modest, but it carried a new clause: community oversight with public minutes and published expenditures. Naomi stood beside him, tapping a pen like a sympathetic metronome. "How does it feel?" she asked. The air that month smelled of paint and new plywood as the first small projects began, and headlines were cautiously optimistic. Veronica had paid fines and cooperated with the investigation. Veronica, and while parts of her empire were now in legal limbo, she had begun to make gestures towards restitution. The local news covered the early work with curiosity. Elijah visited a community center to speak with residents, the smell there rich with dinners in preparation and the noise of kids. He spoke about accountability and the habit of looking at balance sheets as a form of caring. The camera caught him laughing with a child who had been playing with cardboard models of houses. The community, which had feared being tokenized, now had a voice in how funds would be used, and the first month was full of small, messy, hopeful steps. After 3 months, the picture had more detail. Investigators had produced a formal report, and prosecutors were ready to move forward with charges that could carry years of consequences. Veronica's defense had become more conciliatory, and some early allies had turned into distancing voices. Elijah had been appointed to a small oversight committee, his name printed on a letterhead like a small official stamp. The projects now included a heating initiative for seniors, a repair program for single-parent households, and a legal clinic offering pro bono advice. The smell in the meetings was of hot coffee and determinations, and the volunteers who came to help brought energy and patience. Naomi had started a program teaching community members basic auditing and reporting skills, converting skepticism into tools. The City Council began to look at procurement policies, tightening how grants were approved and requiring multiple signatures and public postings for projects over certain amounts. Public reaction had been complex. Some applauded the steps, and others demanded longer prison sentences. Veronica lived in a more solitary orbit, giving rare interviews that sounded regretful and corporate. 6 months later, the consequences had solidified into a new reality. Veronica faced charges that included fraud and misappropriation, and a trial date loomed like a horizon. Her foundation had been dissolved and some assets frozen while restitution was calculated. The community projects were now running under the supervision of a coalition that included Elijah, Naomi, and independent auditors. Numbers were published monthly, and transparency was written into bylaws so the public could track progress. Elijah had become an unlikely leader, his voice steadier and honed by the kind of scrutiny that exposes cracks. His mother, Denise, watched him with pride and worry. Hands that once scrubbed linens now rested on a table with the newspaper spread out like a map. Friends like Liam, the bartender, and Maria, the tailor, came to volunteer nights, bringing coffee and a willingness to help. Investors who supported the rebuilding insisted on strict reporting and community input. Veronica, now quieter and more reflective, made a public contribution to the fund and attended a meeting where she listened more than she spoke. The courtroom drama had not yet ended, but the community had reclaimed a narrative of action over spectacle. The epilogue read like proof that consequence and repair can be messy partners, slow and sometimes imperfect. In the end, the lesson was not simple. What began as a stunt born of arrogance and a desire to humiliate revealed a deeper truth about power, accountability, and the unexpected forms of justice. Veronica learned that reputation is fragile and that spectacle can bring consequences that are hard to manage. Elijah learned that visibility can be repurposed into responsibility, that being thrust into the light carries obligations not only to oneself but to those who had been overlooked. The community gained both repairs and a voice. Naomi and Charles and Samuel and Rosa and Liam and Maria became names that threaded through the narrative as people who had chosen to act. If you were in that ballroom, what would you have done when the papers hit the floor? Comment with one word that describes your reaction: shocked, inspired, or vindicated, and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe if this story moved you and you want more real accounts of people who turned public moments into lasting change. In a world where some acts are staged for applause, sometimes a small, honest step toward justice rewrites what seemed permanent, and the memory of a ring can change from a symbol of humiliation into an instrument of reckoning.